The morning I found the wreath, I stood in the gravel with my hands at my sides and did not move for a long time. Hatch sat beside my left boot, his nose working the cold air in slow sweeps, his tail moving just enough to tell me he was not afraid. The wreath was centered on the hood of the car, pine boughs woven tight and doubled back on themselves, juniper threaded through in sprigs, and dried mountain flowers I could not name tucked into the spaces between. It was not rough work. Whoever made it, whatever made it, had taken care. And there, pressed into the weave near the bottom, still slightly silver with frost, was the juniper sprig I had set on that hood myself the night before. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I have been a funeral director for 27 years. I have spent more of my life around death than most people care to think about. I am not a man who frightens easily, and I am not a man who reaches for the strange explanation when the plain one is sitting right there. So, when I tell you that I could not come up with a plain explanation for what I was looking at that morning, I need you to understand what that admission cost me. To understand why I was standing in that gravel with a wreath on my hood and no words in my mouth, I need to go back to the autumn before, and to Ruth. Ruth Preston died on the 28th of October, 14 months before that November morning at the pull-off. She had been sick for 2 winters with a lung illness that moved slowly, and then, near the end, not slowly at all. I had carried people's grief my entire adult life. I had sat with widowers and widows at my arrangement desk and listened to them try to describe the dimensions of something that could not be measured. I had thought, more than once, that I understood what they were telling me. I did not. You cannot understand it from the outside. You can be kind and patient and present, and you will still not understand it until you are sitting in your own kitchen at 5 in the morning and the house is so quiet you can hear the refrigerator's compressor cycle on and off, and you realize you have been listening for a voice that is not going to come. She was 51 years old. That is a fact I have had to say aloud more times than I expected, and it still lands like something dropped on hardwood. I ran the funeral home in town for the last 18 years. Which meant that most nights I was the one who drove the remains transport on the route through the high pass, because we were a small operation, and I did not believe in asking my staff to take the mountain road after dark if I could take it myself. It is a county road through about 11 miles of mixed timber and rock, steep on the west side and steep on the east. And in November it can be ice before the temperature gauge on your dashboard acknowledges that anything has changed. I had driven it 4 or 5 nights a week for most of those 18 years. Ruth had started calling me on that stretch. This was before she was sick, years before. She worked evenings at the county library, and the timing worked out that I would be climbing the pass right around when she was locking up and walking to her car. We would talk for the 20-odd minutes it took me to cross and come down the other side, and then I would be back in cell range on the lower road, and she would be home, and we would have already said most of what needed saying that day. It was one of those arrangements that grows up without either person deciding to make it. It just became the shape of our evenings. After she died, I kept driving the route. I told myself it was practical, that I was the one who knew the road best in poor conditions, that it made sense for me to take the transport nights. That was true enough. It was also true that driving it was the closest thing I had to talking to her. I did not turn on the radio on that stretch. I drove it in whatever quiet the mountain offered. She had one habit I had always found slightly impractical, which was that she kept sprigs of juniper in the cup holder of her car from October through December. She believed, in the undemonstrative way she believed things, that juniper was good luck on difficult roads. She had grown up in the high country, and her grandmother had told her something about juniper and mountain passes, And she had carried the belief forward the way people carry the small things that connect them to people they loved. When she started riding with me on transport nights early in our marriage, she would set a juniper sprig on the dashboard. When she stopped coming along, she left one on the hood at the trailhead pull-off for me to find when I returned. It became a ritual. The pull-off was a wide gravel shoulder at the base of the west approach, and she would drive up, place the sprig, and drive home. I would stop there on my way back down, and it would be there on the hood. I had not told this to many people. When I say many, I mean I had told it to our daughter Cora once, years ago, and she had smiled the way adult children smile when their parents reveal some small tenderness they did not know about. And then Ruth was gone, and the ritual was not something anyone could do for me anymore. So I started doing it myself. I know how that sounds. A 53-year-old man stopping at a pull-off in the dark and laying a juniper sprig on his own car hood before he drives the mountain. I am aware of how it sounds. I did it anyway. I had found in the 14 months since October that the things that felt slightly absurd were often the only ones that helped. I would cut the sprig before I left the house, keep it in the cup holder the way she always had, and stop at the pull-off on the way up rather than the way down, and set it on the hood, just for the duration of the drive. Then I would collect it coming back and put it in the compost heap at home and cut a fresh one the next time. Hatch would come with me on those nights. He was 9 years old, a beagle with the particular kind of patience that old dogs develop when they have decided their person needs company more than exercise. He did not ride in the back. He rode on the passenger seat with his chin on the door armrest, and when I stopped at the pull-off, he would watch me set the sprig and then settle back down without ceremony. Cora and I had not spoken in 7 months by the time that November night came around. That estrangement is harder to explain than Ruth's death, because there is no single moment I can point to. After the funeral, Cora had wanted me to come stay with her in the valley for a while, and I had said I needed to stay near the home and the business, which was true, but was also a way of not saying that I did not know how to be with anyone who had also loved Ruth. Our grief was too close in shape, and I did not know how to hold mine and help with hers at the same time. I told myself that was a temporary situation. 7 months made it something else. I had her number. I looked at it some evenings. I set the phone down and went to bed. November came in cold that year, the kind of cold that arrives before the calendar says it should, with frost on the downhill side of every surface and ice at the pull-off when the temperature dropped past 20 after midnight. I had a transport on a Tuesday night, a man from the north end of the county who had died quietly in the hospital and whose family needed him home for the service on Thursday. I had driven the pass in worse conditions and the forecast was clear, so I went. I cut the juniper in the yard before I left. Hatch watched from the porch step, ears lifted, as he always did when I was preparing for a night drive. I opened the passenger door, and he came down the steps in his measured, arthritic way and settled himself on the seat. The air had a specific quality that I had learned to read on mountain road nights, something that sits in the back of the throat like cold metal and tells you to take the turns wider than you think you need to. I knew that air. I was not concerned. The drive up the west side went the way it always went. I noted the ice on the switchbacks at approximately the 4-mile mark, which was usual. The pull-off came up on the right at the base of the approach, and I swung in and stopped. The gravel was sheeted in frost and pale under the headlights. I got out, set the juniper sprig in the center of the hood above the grill where I always set it, and stood for a moment in the cold. I want to tell you what that moment was like honestly, because I have spent 14 months getting it right in my own head, and I think I can now. Standing at the pull-off in the dark with the juniper in place, the trees solid black on both sides and the road going up into nothing you could see, was the closest I came to feeling like she had simply stepped inside and would be back in a moment. Not that she was present, not anything supernatural, just that the ritual was the shape of something that had once contained her, the way a coat holds the warmth of the person who wore it for a little while after they take it off. I let myself stand in that for the handful of seconds it took, and then I got back in the cab. Hatch had his chin on the armrest. He did not lift his head when I returned. He had already decided the night was uninteresting, which was the kind of judgment I had learned to trust. The transport went without incident. The pass was cold but dry at the summit, and the east descent was clear. I picked up the deceased, documented the transfer, and drove back. By the time I came over the top and down the west side, it was past midnight, and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees. I came through the pull-off without stopping, because the juniper sprig would be collected in the morning, on my way out, which was the habit I had settled into. Hatch was asleep. I drove the lower 11 miles in the dark and put the car in the garage at home and went inside. I went to bed without eating, which had become a habit I was not proud of. The alarm went out at 6:15. I dressed in the grey pre-dawn and made coffee, which I drank standing at the counter because I had stopped sitting at the kitchen table. Ruth had liked the table. It was her table in a way that my standing at the counter was not, and sitting at it alone had started to feel like trespassing on something. I know that is not a logical distinction. I am telling you how it was. Hatch came in from the bedroom and stood at the back door until I opened it for him. He went out into the frost and moved around the yard with the slow investigation of an old dog who has been through many cold mornings and is not going to be rushed by any of them. I watched him through the back window while my coffee cooled. I drove out to the pull-off at 7:30 to collect the juniper sprig and then continued to the funeral home for the morning's work. The road was still frozen in the shadows, and the light was the low, pale gold of a late autumn morning that does not intend to fully arrive. Hatch was with me on the seat. He did not sleep on the morning drives the way he slept on the night drives. He sat upright and watched the trees go by as though he were being paid to count them. I pulled into the pull-off and my headlights caught the hood. I left the engine running. I got out in the cold and I walked to the front of the car and I stood looking at it. The wreath was the length of my forearm, roughly circular, woven from pine boughs that had been bent and worked until they held their shape without tying. Juniper was threaded through it, not tucked loosely, but woven into the structure as though whoever made it had thought about how the two materials would hold against each other. And the dried flowers, small and pale, pressed into the gaps between the branches with the kind of placement that takes time and attention. It was sitting flat on the hood, centered, and the juniper sprig I had left the night before was there beneath it, visible at the bottom of the ring where the weave was slightly open. I did not touch it for a long time. The first explanation I reached for was a person, someone who had seen me stop here nights, someone who knew about Ruth or about the sprig, someone who had decided to do something kind and had done it anonymously. That explanation lasted about 2 minutes, which is roughly how long it took me to look at the frost. The pull-off was sheeted in an unbroken surface of overnight frost, fine-grained even, the kind that comes in still air and records everything that touches it. My own boot prints were there from the night before, 2 clean impressions near the driver's door where I had stepped out and back. There were no other human prints, none approaching from the road, none from the tree line. I walked the full perimeter of the pull-off, which was not large, perhaps 40 feet across at its widest point, and the frost was intact everywhere except where I had just walked and where I had walked the night before. The second explanation I reached for was an animal carrying material to the car by accident, some combination of pack rat behavior and coincidence producing what looked deliberate. I am a precise man. I know what I am capable of reasoning myself into when the alternative is uncomfortable. I stood there and I looked at the wreath, and I acknowledged to myself that no animal behavior I knew of produced woven structures. The boughs had been bent and interlaced. The juniper had been placed with intent. A pack rat does not weave. The third explanation was that I had been more tired than I realized and had left later, or had stopped on my way back instead of on my way up, and someone had been there during a window I had not accounted for. I sat with that one the longest. I went back to the sequence in my memory, the way I do when I am trying to determine cause of death from a presenting condition, methodically and without attachment to any particular answer. I had stopped on the way up, set the sprig, gotten back in immediately. I had come back through without stopping. There was no unaccounted window. And regardless of window, the frost still had no prints. That was when I found the depression. It was beside the driver's door, on the tree-line side of where I had been standing. I had missed it on my first pass because I had been looking at the frost globally for human footprints, and this was not a human footprint. It was an impression rather than a track, a single contact point with no toe separation, elongated and deep enough to have pressed through the frost and slightly into the gravel beneath. I put my size 11 boot alongside it. The impression was longer than my boot by a noticeable margin, not by an inch, by several inches. The edges were clean, which meant it had been made in the dark, before the overnight frost had any chance to soften. I stood up slowly. Hatch had gotten out of the car while I was walking the perimeter, and I had not heard him do it. He was standing a few feet from the impression with his nose about 2 inches off the frost, working in his patient, circular way. His tail was low and his ears were forward, which in 9 years of watching that dog was the position he took when something interested him without alarming him. He was not afraid. I watched him stand there for a full minute, checking and rechecking whatever information the air was giving him, and then he lifted his head and looked at me with his dark eyes and wagged once, a single slow movement. That was the first thing that softened me, not the wreath itself, not the depression in the frost. Hatch's tail. I am not a man who believes in things he cannot explain. I want to be clear about that. I have arranged more funerals than I can easily count. I have sat with more families in shock and grief and disorientation than I have words for. I have heard people say that they felt the presence of the person they lost, that there had been a sign, that something outside the ordinary had touched them at a moment they needed it. I have always been respectful when people said those things. I have never said them myself. I stood at the pull-off with the wreath on my hood, and the frost unmarked around me, and an impression beside my door that was longer than my boot, and I did not have a category for what I was looking at. What I had was this. Someone had taken the juniper sprig I put on that hood, the one continuation of a private ritual that had no audience and no purpose except its own small maintenance of love, and had answered it, had woven something around it, incorporated it, made the sprig the center of a larger thing, rather than just a sprig alone on a cold piece of metal. I thought about what that meant for a while. I stood in the cold and the pale November light, and I thought about what it means when something you do in private, something you do because grief leaves you with very few options, and you do the small things because the alternative is doing nothing, when something like that is noticed and answered, not observed, not recorded, answered. I carefully lifted the wreath from the hood. It was heavier than I expected, dense and well made. The juniper sprig came with it, nested in the weave at the bottom. I set the wreath on the passenger seat, where Hatch inspected it for 30 seconds, and then lay his chin on the pine boughs with a small exhalation, as though he had decided they were acceptable. I drove to the funeral home. I set the wreath on my desk in the back office. I looked at it while I prepared the documentation for Thursday's service. I looked at it while I made phone calls and confirmed the flowers order, and spoke to the family about the graveside arrangements. And somewhere around 2 in the afternoon, I picked up my phone and found the number I had been setting down for 7 months. I sat for a moment with the phone in my hand. Then I pressed the call. Cora answered on the third ring, which told me she had seen my name and chosen to pick up, which is a different thing from answering a call you did not expect. "Dad." That was all she said first. "Hi, sweetheart." My voice came out thicker than I intended, which I had not braced for. "I know it's been. I wanted to." I stopped and started again. "I should have called before now." A pause on her end. Then, "I should have too." Neither of us said anything for a moment. We were both used to silence, both products of the same household where a long pause was not a failure of conversation, but a form of it. After a while she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm working on it," which was the most honest answer I had given anyone in several months. We talked for 40 minutes. Not about everything and not about anything resolved. We talked about her work, which had changed since I last knew the details. We talked about the winter coming. At some point she mentioned a visit, a maybe visit, a possibility, and I said that would be good. And I meant it in a way that reached back through 7 months of not meaning things. When we hung up, I sat in my office with the wreath on the desk, and the afternoon light going grey at the window, and I did not try to account for anything. Not the weave of it, not the depression in the frost, not the size of whatever had stood beside my car in the dark. I did not try to name it. I just let it be the size it was. I have told this story twice, once to my sister, the winter after it happened, over coffee at her kitchen table, and she listened the way she listens to things that do not fit into the frame she uses for the world, which is to say, quietly and without objection. She did not say she believed me, and she did not say she did not. She said, "That's something, Dustin," which is probably the right response, and once to you, now. Those are the 2 times. The following spring, the last of March, when the frost was finally off the lower road, but still holding in the shadows at elevation, I drove the pass on a clear morning with no transport, nothing to carry except Hatch on the seat beside me and the habit of the drive itself. I brought a juniper sprig, cut from the yard that morning. I stopped at the pull-off. The gravel was bare and the trees were the particular green of conifers that have come through winter intact, a deeper and more certain colour than they show in summer. The pull-off looked ordinary in the spring light, just a wide shoulder with tread marks and some gravel pushed to the edges by snowplows. Nothing to mark it as different from any other pull-off on any other mountain road. I got out. Hatch got out. He walked directly to the spot beside the driver's door, the spot where the impression had been in November, and put his nose down and worked it for a long moment. Then he came back to my side and sat. I set the juniper sprig on the hood. I stood in the clear morning and I listened to the trees and the creak noise coming from somewhere below the road and the small sounds a high-elevation forest makes in the early spring when things are starting to move again. I was not waiting for anything. I was not hoping for anything. I was doing what I had come to do. The wreath was back at the funeral home, hung inside the office on a nail beside the window. It had dried to a harder thing over the winter, the pine boughs going brittle and the flowers gone to pale dust. But the shape of it was still clear, and the juniper was still threaded through it, still recognizable. I looked at it most mornings. Some mornings I looked at it and thought about Ruth, and about the sprig she used to leave for me, and about how the things we do for love are rarely witnessed and rarely require witnesses to be worth doing. Some mornings I just looked at it and let it be what it was, which was something that had no good name. The pass road in the spring, in the early morning with the light coming flat through the gaps in the ridge, is one of the quieter places I have known. I have driven it for 18 years, and there are still mornings when it surprises me with that. The trees run right to the edge of the gravel on both sides for long stretches, dark and close, and then the road lifts and opens onto a section of bare rock with a view west that can stop you. On this particular morning, the sky was the colour of thin ice over deep water, pale blue going nearly white at the horizon, and the peaks to the north still carried their November snow. I had thought in the weeks after finding the wreath that I would look differently at the tree line on the drive, that I would watch it the way you watch a door that opened once when you did not expect it to. I did look differently for a while. By spring that had softened into something else, something that was less watching and more knowing. The same way you stop checking the porch light every 10 minutes after someone says they will be home late. You know the light is on. You leave it on. You go about your evening. I stayed at the pull-off for perhaps a quarter of an hour. Hatch sat beside my boot and looked at the trees with his ears slightly forward and his tail making occasional slow movements. He was not alarmed. He was not alert in any urgent way. He was doing what old dogs do in places that have a particular smell, which is to register it and be comfortable in it. When I got back in the car, the juniper sprig was on the hood. I looked at it for a moment through the windshield. Then I put the car in drive and pulled back onto the road and went up the pass in the clear spring morning, the sprig bright green against the dark metal, and I drove the 11 miles the way I had always driven them. Hatch slept the whole way, his nose resting on the door armrest, one ear folded down and one ear up, the way he always slept when the road was good. I still drive the pass most nights there is a transport to run. I still cut the juniper on my way out, still stop at the pull-off, still set the sprig in the centre of the hood, and take a moment before I drive up into the dark. The dried wreath hangs beside the window in the back office of the funeral home, where I can see it when I am at my desk, where the morning light catches the needles in a way that makes them show some green, even now. Cora visited in May. She came for 4 days, and on the second day I drove her up to the pull-off in the afternoon, before the light went. I showed her the place, the gravel and the tree line, and the pull-off's specific position at the base of the west approach. I showed her the spot where I always set the sprig. I did not try to explain everything. I told her about her mother's habit, which she had not known in detail. I told her about continuing it. She stood by the car for a long time with her hands in her jacket pockets and did not say much, and after a while she reached into the cup holder and took out the juniper sprig I had brought and set it on the hood herself. We drove home as the sun went below the ridge. I do not know what it was, the thing that stood beside my car that November night and did the work it did. I have not seen it. I have only seen what it left. I have thought about it in the way I think about things that cannot be fully accounted for, which is carefully and without reaching for a conclusion I have not earned. What I know is what I could see and touch and measure. The wreath, the sprig inside it, the frost unmarked around the car, the impression in the gravel beside my door, longer than my boot. Hatch has no opinion on the matter that he has shared with me, and in the mornings when I look at the wreath on the nail by the window, I do not think about what it was or what it meant in any large sense. I think about the night it was made, out there in the cold and the dark at the base of the pass, when something moved through the frost without leaving a mark I could follow, and took the small thing I had left and answered it with something larger and more patient and more carefully made than the small thing deserved. That is enough to think about. That keeps me a while. The world, I have come to believe, keeps better watch on us than we keep on ourselves.